Welcome back, I'm George, and today we will be unboxing and taking a look at the new Samsung Galaxy A16, which, as many of you know, is the latest entry-tier smartphone from Samsung, meant to give you everything you need for under $200. As always, I'm also going to compare it to last year's model, in this case the Samsung Galaxy A15, so you can have an idea of what's new and what's the same. As you can see, much like last year, we get a pretty thin box, so no wall brick or earbuds, unfortunately. We just get the phone in this little cardboard box with the USB-C cable, a SIM ejection tool, and some instruction manuals. The phone comes wrapped in a semi-transparent paper, as its one and only protection. After getting it up and running, which by the way, you can now do automatically by syncing your old device, the first thing you'll notice is that the phone is a little bit bigger, with 6.7 inches as opposed to 6.5 on last year's model. It is not that noticeable having them side by side, but when you hold the new A16 in your hand, it does feel noticeably bigger. That said, the design is almost identical as opposed to last year's model. We still have the same 3-camera layout with no extra casing, the same overall shapes and corner angles, and more or less the same thickness. There is only 2 minor differences I found. One being that now it has a matte textured back instead of glossy, which I'm pretty sure will help with fingerprints. And unfortunately, the other difference is that it doesn't have a headphone jack, so we won't be able to connect wired earbuds like we could before. Now, on the other side, there is a nice little improvement. The Galaxy A16 is now IP64 rated, meaning that it is sealed against dirt and water splashes. This, of course, doesn't mean that you can or should actively expose the phone to water, but if you accidentally do, this extra level of protection will prevent water from getting into the phone and risking the internal components. As you can see, we still get that nice double-purpose SIM slot, good for either 2 SIM cards or 1 SIM card and 1 micro SD card. So ideally, you want to get this phone with the base 128GB storage and then get a cheap 256GB micro SD card on Amazon, which will definitely be more than enough for all of your apps, games, photos, and music. By the way, I left links for both the phone and the best micro SD card down below in the description. As I said, the physical size of the display is a little bit bigger, with 6.7 inches, but this unfortunately did not affect the frames around the phone. We still have the old teardrop style notch and a rather thick bottom chin, which makes the phone look a little bit dated. In fact, it actually does feel a little bit thicker than on the A15. There's no official measures to prove it, but that's at least what I thought when comparing them side by side. Resolution is 1080 by 2340 pixels with a 19.5 by 9 ratio and more or less 385 pixels per inch. Brightness is still maxed at 800 nits, but now the phone has a new boost mode for outdoor conditions when you need a little bit more intensity to see what's on your display. As always, the display is one of the strong selling point features on this phone. It is made by Samsung themselves, and it is very well calibrated. Using the latest OLED technologies, it is able to produce those nice inky blacks, rich colors, and great contrast, while at the same time being true to life and properly balanced. That said, Samsung lets you choose between 2 different screen modes. First, you have Vivid, which is the one you get by default and leans more toward color intensity and being pleasing to look at, so to say, and then Natural, which looks a little bit more true to life. Also here on the settings, the phone lets you choose between high motion smoothness at 90Hz and standard at 60. My advice is that you leave it at 90 since the phone has really good battery life, and this will help the phone feel a bit faster when navigating the menus and some compatible apps. That being said though, don't expect to play games at a steady 90Hz since that would require a lot of graphical power that this phone simply doesn't have. Now, just like last year, this phone has two sets of speakers, one located at the front on top of the notch and meant to be your ear speaker for phone calls. The second is located in the bottom near the USB-C port, and it's meant to play media or music. Unfortunately, this phone does not have stereo audio. The top speaker doesn't get nearly as loud as the bottom one, so it is only meant to do one thing. Moving on, let's talk about the internal components. This phone, in its base configuration, will give you 4 GB of RAM, upgradable to 6 or 8, with 128 GB, upgradable to 256. Now, availability for these different models will greatly depend on where you buy the phone and when. Right now, for example, in my hometown country, Spain, the phone is only available with 4 GB of RAM unless you order one from abroad through Amazon. On the other hand, if you live in the US, you will find both the 6 and 8 GB versions with no issues. What is equal to all Galaxy A16s is their new Exynos 1330 processor, which, although is technically an improvement compared to last year's model, when performing a Geekbench test, as you can see, it gives almost identical results. Now, I'm not saying it is not going to perform better than the old A15, since there are more factors than just raw power, but it is definitely underwhelming to see that there is no apparent changes in this department. Now, in my own experience, I found that it is good for most of the basic day-to-day tasks most people demand from their smartphone. Browsing social media, taking pictures here and there, listening to music, and playing some basic games. When performing these tasks, the phone felt absolutely fine, with smooth animations in motion, partially thanks of course to those 90 Hz I mentioned earlier. Although that said, and to be fair, there were also some hiccups here and there, especially when turning on the phone for the first time. When it comes to games, I was pleasantly surprised with how the phone performed in most cases, including both basic 2D phone games and more demanding 3D experiences like Call of Duty or Asphalt 9. The only game that remains completely unplayable is Genshin Impact. This game is, simply put, way too demanding for this phone. The only way I managed to get a smooth frame rate was playing at the lowest possible settings and 30 FPS, which, as you can see, is not a very pleasant gaming experience. Overall, I would give this phone a basic seal of approval, since when it comes to its performance and capabilities, it is neither good or bad. It is exactly what you would expect from a $200 device. Now, what was actually a very pleasant surprise was to see Samsung trickle down their commitment to software updates to their less expensive devices. The Galaxy A16, as stated on Samsung's own official website, will get 6 full years of software support, including One UI and Android. So you will essentially be covered with the latest and greatest features until 2031. That said, when it comes to the battery, we get the same 5,000 mAh unit we can find in most budget Samsung phones. In fact, that is actually one of the main advantages of these entry-level phones with big displays. Since their processors are not as powerful and their displays are not as fancy, these phones can actually get you better battery life compared to most flagship devices, including Samsung's own Galaxy S24 Ultra, which, funny enough, has the same 5,000 mAh capacity. Now, in my own experience, I have gotten about 2 full days of usage without touching a charger. Mind you, at full resolution, 90 Hz refresh rate, and not a single battery life optimization functionality enabled. Additionally, you will get up to 25-watt charging, so the phone will go from 0 to 100 in about an hour and a half. When it comes to the cameras on the back, we get the same 5-megapixel ultra-wide camera, which, spoiler alert, is not good, We get a 50 megapixel main 1x camera, we get a mere 2 megapixel macro lens for close-up photography, and last but not least, on the front, we get a 13 megapixel selfie camera. When it comes to the app interface, nothing has changed as opposed to last year's model. We get the same modes for photo and video and mostly the same settings. I am still confused as to why there is no Pro mode for video and why macro mode is not integrated in the normal photo mode, but as I said, it is essentially the same as last year. As you can see, we have 3 different focal lengths. The 0.5 mode that uses that 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, the 1x code that uses the main 50 megapixel sensor, and then the 2x mode, which many people think uses that third camera on the back, but is actually a crop from the main camera. Now keep in mind there are 2 resolution options for photos, which are 12 megapixels and 50, but there is only a noticeable difference with really good lighting conditions. Also, as you probably expected, that 50 megapixel mode is only available for the 1x camera in its default mode, so you won't be able to use it when there is a 2x crop. Now taking a look at some photo samples, as you can see, pictures from the ultra-wide camera are a little bit underwhelming, to say the least. The camera has a pretty small sensor and only 5 megapixels, so results won't be pleasing, even with good lighting conditions. I recommend you only use this camera when you absolutely need to. Side by side, there is a very noticeable difference with pictures taken using the main 1x sensor, which gets much better shapes, colors, and a lot more detail. I believe the main camera does a pretty good job in pretty much all lighting conditions, although since it also has a relatively small sensor, I advise you manage your expectations for night photography. As you can see, side by side, we still see a clear improvement compared to the ultra-wide camera, but now both are providing underwhelming results. Now, when it comes to the 2x crop, I was pretty surprised, since it retains most of the quality compared to the native 1x mode. As you can see, it manages to give noticeably better looking results compared to the ultra-wide camera, even though it is just using a small portion of the main sensor, capturing less light, and at a much lower resolution. For video, there is not much to say since it's maxed out at 1080p 30 fps, and as you can see, results are the bare minimum expected from a phone in 2025. There is barely any detail, dynamic range is very low, and everything looks very poor quality and washed out. I think they should have included a 4K mode to get a little bit better quality. On the other hand, taking a couple selfies with the front-facing camera, I was pretty happy with the overall results. They look sharp enough with a good color science. If there is proper lighting, you can even see individual hairs zooming in, which is pretty impressive considering the physical size of the camera and its phone-like optics. As I said earlier, this phone is one of the most popular out there. The previous A15 was a bestseller, being up there in the ranks with the latest flagship iPhones for all 2024. So it is understandable that Samsung wanted to keep things simple and subtly improve the formula instead of making any big changes. Everyone knows that when something works, you just leave it as is, and that's exactly what Samsung did with the new A16. I believe the reason this phone is so successful is that it is one of the cheapest phones you can buy that still gives you all of the features most people use and need. And well, also it is made by Samsung, which, believe it or not, it is sort of a seal of quality. A lot of people know the brand and trust it, so they prefer to buy from Samsung than from a Chinese company they never heard of. I believe this phone will continue to top the ranks in 2025, and it will serve many people for many years thanks to those 6 years of updates. If you were interested in buying it, I recommend you do. Remember, you have an Amazon link for both the phone and the micro SD card down below in the description.